It is the winter of 1942, and somewhere over the black water of the North Atlantic, a Focke-Wulf F-value 200 Condor banks lazily through the cloud cover, its crew scanning the convoy below with practiced patience. The aircraft has already done its work. A radio signal sent, coordinates confirmed. Within hours, a U-boat wolfpack will converge on that convoy, like wolves tightening on a wounded elk. Merchant sailors hauling aviation fuel and tinned beef from Halifax to Liverpool will die in the freezing water before morning. They will die not because the Allies lacked courage or ships or even weapons. They will die because there is no Allied aircraft close enough to stop what is coming. The nearest land-based fighter is 500 miles away. The nearest aircraft carrier is further still. And in the brutal arithmetic of the mid-Atlantic gap, that vast, lawless stretch of ocean beyond the reach of any land-based air cover, the U-boats are winning. Churchill knows it. The admirals know it. The supply lines that keep Britain alive are being severed, one convoy at a time, in the darkness of a gap that no amount of courage can simply close. 6 million tons of Allied shipping are lost in 1942 alone. The numbers are catastrophic. They are, in the most literal sense, existential. Britain runs on imported food, imported oil, imported steel. Without the convoys, the island starves. And into this crisis, in the autumn of 1942, walks a man with a memorandum. It is not a long memorandum. It does not come from the Admiralty, or from the Air Ministry, or from any of the great bureaucratic engines of British war planning. It comes from a 51-year-old maverick inventor named Geoffrey Pike, a man who has already spent the war generating ideas at a rate that exhausts his colleagues and bewilders his superiors. Some of them brilliant, many of them impractical, and one of them so staggering in its ambition, so apparently lunatic in its conception, that it will consume millions of pounds, occupy the attention of 2 heads of state, and remain one of the most extraordinary episodes of the entire Second World War. Pike's idea is simple to state and almost impossible to believe. He wants to build an aircraft carrier out of ice. Not a small one, not an experimental one. A carrier so enormous it would dwarf every vessel then afloat. Nearly 2,000 feet long, 200 feet wide, displacing 2 million tons of water, capable of carrying 150 aircraft and housing a crew of several thousand men inside its frozen hull. Unsinkable, he claims, unkillable, impervious to torpedoes because ice, unlike steel, simply absorbs the blast, and, crucially, free. Because wherever there is seawater and cold weather, there is the raw material to build another one. Churchill reads the memorandum in his bath. He is, by all accounts, immediately fascinated. He writes across the top of it, in his own hand, "Pray, investigate." And so begins Project Habakkuk. To understand why anyone took Geoffrey Pike seriously, you have to understand just how desperate the situation in the Atlantic had become by the middle of 1942. The mid-Atlantic gap, sometimes called the Black Pit, was a region roughly centered between Iceland, Greenland, and Newfoundland, where no land-based aircraft could reach. The short Sunderland flying boats, operated by RRAF Coastal Command, had a range of roughly 900 miles from their bases. American B-24 Liberators, when they were eventually pressed into anti-submarine work, could push that range further. But even they could not close the gap entirely. The gap was, in simple terms, a killing ground. In the first 6 months of 1942, U-boats sank over 500 Allied ships. In November of that year, the figure for monthly losses reached over 700,000 tons of shipping destroyed, a figure that represented not just steel and oil, but the lives of the sailors aboard and the food that never reached British tables. The Battle of the Atlantic was, Churchill would later write, the one campaign of the war that truly frightened him. Not the Blitz, not the fall of France, not even the shadow of a German invasion. The Atlantic. Conventional solutions were being pursued. More aircraft carriers were under construction, merchant aircraft carriers. Ordinary cargo ships with the flight deck bolted on top were being rushed into service. The Americans were building escort carriers at extraordinary speed. But all of these solutions shared the same fundamental problem. They were made of steel, and in 1942, steel was the one thing the Allied war economy genuinely could not spare. Every pound of steel that went into an aircraft carrier was a pound that could not go into a tank or a bomber or a landing craft. The demands on British and American steelworks were already beyond anything the industry had previously contemplated. A conventional aircraft carrier of the size Pike was imagining would require 200,000 tons of steel and take 2 years to build. There was no possibility of producing them fast enough to matter. Pike's solution, at its heart, was an attempt to escape the steel constraint entirely. Ice was abundant. Ice was free. Ice could be manufactured wherever temperatures were cold enough. And ice, Pike reasoned, was very difficult to sink. The problem, and there was, as anyone could immediately see, a rather significant problem, was that ice melts. The man tasked with turning Pike's fever dream into engineering reality was a young researcher named Max Perutz, then working out of the Cavendish Laboratory in Cambridge. Perutz would go on to win the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1962 for work on the structure of hemoglobin. But in the winter of 1942, he was spending his days in a cold store in London, experimenting with frozen water. The fundamental challenge was structural. Pure ice is brittle. Strike it hard enough and it shatters. A torpedo strike against a pure ice hull might not sink the vessel. The blast would largely be absorbed. But repeated impacts, or the simple action of ocean swells against a sharp edge, would cause progressive cracking and fragmentation. You could not build a 2,000-foot vessel from ordinary ice and expect it to survive even a moderate sea state, let alone a determined enemy attack. Perutz discovered the answer almost by accident. Whilst reviewing research papers, he encountered work suggesting that wood pulp mixed into ice dramatically altered the material's properties. He began experimenting with ratios. What he found was remarkable. A mixture of roughly 14% wood pulp, essentially sawdust, combined with 86% water, when frozen, produced a material that was almost unrecognizable as ice. It had the compressive strength of concrete. It was 3 times as hard to cut as ordinary ice. It was extraordinarily resistant to fracture. And unlike concrete, it floated. This material was given a name, Pykrete, in honor of Geoffrey Pike. And when Lord Mountbatten, then Chief of Combined Operations and one of Habakkuk's most enthusiastic champions, wanted to demonstrate its extraordinary properties to the assembled chiefs of staff, he chose a method that no committee meeting had previously seen, before or since. Mountbatten entered the room carrying 2 blocks. One was ordinary ice. He placed it on the conference table and shot it with a service revolver. It shattered immediately, fragments scattering across the polished wood. He then placed the block of pecrete on the table and shot it also. The bullet ricocheted from the surface and embedded itself in the leg of an admiral sitting nearby. The admiral fortunately survived. Mountbatten had made his point. Pecrete could be manufactured using refrigeration equipment already available to industry. It could be produced at sea, given sufficient cold water and a supply of wood pulp, of which Canada had essentially unlimited quantities. It could be repaired at sea by pouring new pecrete into damaged sections and refreezing it. And it could be kept from melting in temperate waters by insulating the outer hull and running refrigeration pipes through the interior. An enormous engineering undertaking, certainly, but not, in principle, an impossible one. The proposed design for the Habakkuk carrier called for a hull 910 meters long, roughly 6 times the length of the Titanic, and made of pecrete walls some 12 meters thick. The vessel would be self-propelled using a system of outboard motors embedded in the hull, capable of reaching a speed of approximately 7 knots. It would carry enough aviation fuel for sustained operations and house its crew of thousands in compartments carved from the ice itself. The refrigeration system required to keep the hull from melting would demand the output of a substantial industrial plant, all fitted inside the vessel. The estimated weight was 2 million tons. The estimated cost, at 1943 values, was approximately £700,000, a fraction of what a conventional steel carrier would have cost, precisely because the primary material was frozen seawater.
Construction was to begin in Canada, where the cold waters of Patrician Lake in Alberta offered the perfect testing ground. A scaled prototype, 60 meters long and weighing 1,000 tons, was built during the winter of 1942 to 1943, using a team of conscientious objectors who had been assigned to the project, partly because the whole enterprise was so secret that ordinary workers were deemed a security risk. The prototype was refrigerated using a single 1-horsepower motor. When spring arrived and the surrounding lake began to melt, the pecrete prototype sat in the water, stubbornly refusing to follow suit. It did not fully melt until late August. Observers noted that the material seemed to genuinely behave as advertised. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The operational concept for Habakkuk, had it ever reached the Atlantic, was straightforward in outline if staggering in execution. The carrier would be stationed in the mid-Atlantic Gap, the very killing ground where Allied aircraft could not reach. Its aircraft, a mixture of fighters and maritime patrol bombers, would sweep hundreds of miles in every direction, denying the U-boats the freedom of movement they had come to rely upon. Unlike a conventional carrier, Habakkuk would not need to maneuver at speed. Its very size made it largely immune to submarine torpedo attack. A single torpedo would blow a hole roughly the size of a London bus in a hull 12 meters thick, causing negligible structural damage. Multiple simultaneous torpedo strikes might, over time, require patching, but the self-repair capacity built into the design meant that a maintenance crew could pour new pecrete into a damaged section and refreeze it within hours. The psychological dimension was equally significant. German naval planners had grown accustomed to operating in the Black Pit without serious interference. An object the size of a small island appearing in their operating area, impervious to the weapons they possessed, carrying a full complement of anti-submarine aircraft, would have represented a fundamental disruption to U-boat doctrine. The Wolfpack strategy depended on freedom of movement, on the ability to surface, to communicate, to coordinate. An unsinkable aircraft carrier in the middle of the Atlantic would have made all of that extraordinarily dangerous. Records from the period are, in places, frustratingly sparse. Much of the operational planning remains classified or was destroyed after the war. What is documented is the enthusiasm of those at the top of the Allied command structure for the concept and the genuine belief, held at various points by both Churchill and Roosevelt, that Habakkuk might represent a decisive intervention in the Atlantic campaign. The Germans, to their credit, had considered the idea of converting unconventional materials into naval assets, but nothing in the German program approached the radical ambition of Habakkuk. The Kriegsmarine had experimented with various forms of unconventional carrier design, including the conversion of ocean liners, but remained committed to conventional steel construction. The simple reason was that German industry, whilst formidable, did not have access to the same limitless supply of Canadian timber and fresh water that made pykrete a viable proposition for the British. The raw material advantage lay entirely on the Allied side. The Americans, for their part, were simultaneously pursuing escort carriers at a rate that would eventually close the Atlantic gap by conventional means. The USS Bogue-class escort carriers, produced in enormous numbers from 1942 onwards, were small, fast, and cheap by conventional standards, each displacing roughly 8,000 tons and capable of carrying 28 aircraft. They were being commissioned at the rate of roughly one per month by late 1943. Compared to Habakkuk's proposed 2 million tons, they were tiny, but they existed. They were in the water. And by the time the great debate about Habakkuk was reaching its conclusion, they were beginning to have a measurable effect on U-boat loss rates. This is the essential context in which Project Habakkuk must be understood. It was not canceled because it was proven impossible. The prototype demonstrated that pykrete worked. The engineering calculations confirmed that the hull could be built. The refrigeration challenge was daunting but not insuperable. Habakkuk was canceled because by the autumn of 1943, the conventional solutions were beginning to work. The development of centimetric radar, the cracking of the Enigma communications used by the wolf packs, the deployment of long-range liberators in sufficient numbers, and the sheer industrial output of American escort carrier production combined to swing the Battle of the Atlantic decisively in the Allies' favor. By May 1943, Black May, as German submariners called it, 41 U-boats were sunk in a single month. The crisis that had given Habakkuk its urgency was, if not resolved, at least no longer existential. The project was formally suspended in December 1943. The prototype in Patrician Lake was left to melt at its own pace. It took until 1954. It is tempting, in retrospect, to dismiss Project Habakkuk as a curiosity, one of the war's many eccentric dead ends, a footnote in the story of Allied ingenuity. That dismissal would be wrong. The project demonstrated something of lasting significance about the nature of wartime innovation, that the most valuable function of an apparently impossible idea is not necessarily the idea itself, but the pressure it applies to conventional thinking. Habakkuk forced Allied planners to confront, with extraordinary urgency and seriousness, the question of what an aircraft carrier actually needed to be and what it needed to do. The solutions eventually adopted, the escort carrier, the MAC ship, the very long-range patrol aircraft, were all accelerated in their development by the knowledge that the alternative, should they fail, was an ice ship in the North Atlantic. Jeffrey Pike himself did not live to see the full legacy of what he had set in motion. He died in 1948, having spent the post-war years in increasing isolation and depression, his contributions to the war effort largely unacknowledged by the establishment he had so consistently unsettled. He was found in his flat in London with an overdose of sleeping tablets. He was 54 years old. The obituaries were brief. The secrets he had helped to keep were still classified. Max Perutz went on to become one of the most celebrated scientists of the 20th century. He occasionally mentioned pykrete in interviews with a mixture of pride and bemusement, the way one might speak of a particularly eventful gap year. The material he developed, or rather discovered, remains a genuine engineering curiosity. Modern researchers have occasionally revisited pykrete as a potential construction material in cold weather environments, finding that its properties are exactly as Perutz described. It is stronger than concrete, lighter than steel, and given access to cold water and a supply of wood pulp essentially free. The prototype on Patrician Lake left no trace. The lake absorbed it, as lakes will, without ceremony. Return for a moment to that North Atlantic convoy in the winter of 1942, the FW-200 banking above, the signal already sent, the U-boats already moving. Now consider what it would have meant, what it would have changed, to have had sitting at the convergence point of those patrol routes a structure the size of a small town made of ice and sawdust, carrying 150 aircraft and several thousand men, incapable of being sunk by any weapon the Kriegsmarine possessed. The Condor would have found not empty ocean and a defenseless convoy, but a wall of aircraft rising to meet it. The U-boats would have found not a black pit, but a fortress. The merchant sailors hauling aviation fuel and tinned beef would have reached Liverpool. Project Habakkuk never happened, but the thinking that produced it, the refusal to accept that the constraints of the present moment are the constraints of all possible futures, the willingness to ask what an aircraft carrier could be made of if you took away the assumption that it had to be steel, that thinking shaped the way the Allies fought the rest of the war. It shaped the boldness of the amphibious operations. It shaped the willingness to pursue Mulberry Harbors, Pluto pipelines, and Fido fog dispersal systems. It shaped a culture of radical improvisation that proved in the end to be one of the decisive advantages of the Allied cause. Jeffrey Pike wrote in his original memorandum, "It is necessary to be systematic about being unsystematic." He meant that breaking the rules had to be done deliberately, methodically, with as much rigor as obeying them. The Habakkuk Project was, in its way, exactly that. A systematic attempt to shatter the assumptions that were getting people killed, examined with seriousness by some of the finest scientific and engineering minds in the country, and carried far enough that it changed the debate even when it did not become a reality. Britain did not build a flying warship. It did something harder. It proved that the idea was not, in principle, impossible, and in doing so it changed what everyone else thought was possible too. The ice melted, the idea did not.